The Senate Judiciary Committee chamber hummed with restrained anticipation as Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana slid his glasses down the bridge of his nose and leaned toward the microphone. Opposite him, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett sat at the witness table, her posture poised and deliberate. The former civil rights lawyer had been invited to testify as an expert on criminal justice reform, a topic she not only understood from years of legal work but carried deep conviction about. The polished wood of the dais gleamed under television lights, and the gallery was packed shoulder to shoulder with reporters, advocates, and aides. What had been expected to be another procedural hearing on sentencing reform had just taken a sharp turn. Kennedy's slow Louisiana drawl filled the room. "Congresswoman Crockett," he began, drawing out every syllable. "I've listened carefully to your testimony, but I'll be honest, I can't make heads or tails of your logic." The sentence landed with surgical precision. Kennedy was famous for questions that sounded harmless but cut deep. His folksy routine, part charm, part trap, had humbled cabinet secretaries, CEOs, and law professors alike. He flipped through his notes. "You've said mandatory minimums are, and I quote, fundamentally unfair and counterproductive. Yet you also call for mandatory sentences in some white-collar crimes. Where I come from, we've got a saying, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. So help me understand, ma'am. Are mandatory sentences wrong, or are they right? You can't have it both ways." The line hung in the air. Even the camera operators seemed to stop moving. Kennedy set his glasses on the table and fixed his gaze on the witness. His tone was polite. His question was a trap. Around the room, senators and staff leaned forward. Crockett reached for the glass of water before her, took a slow sip, and set it down carefully. The cameras caught her expression. Composed, unreadable. Those who had followed her legal career knew she had stood before tougher judges and sharper cross-examiners. But Kennedy's brand of down-home logic, sugar-coated yet barbed, required another kind of precision. Instead of bracing for defense, Crockett allowed herself the faintest smile. It was a small, controlled gesture, but enough to ripple through the gallery. Kennedy blinked once, surprised. "Senator Kennedy," she said evenly, "I actually appreciate that question. It gives me a chance to clear up something that often gets misunderstood." Something in her voice, measured, confident, and unhurried, shifted the rhythm of the room. Kennedy, who usually jumped in to press his advantage, paused instead. No one in that chamber could have predicted how her next few sentences would travel beyond the hearing room, watched and rewatched millions of times across social platforms by nightfall. Kennedy's persona was a paradox by design. Since joining the Senate in 2017, he had built an image that mixed Ivy League intellect with small-town candor. He liked to call himself just a country lawyer, though his resume included Harvard Law and Oxford. Beneath the homespun aphorisms was a legal mind known for precision and trap-setting. A former Senate staffer once put it bluntly to Politico, "Senator Kennedy plays dumb like a fox. He sounds like your uncle at Thanksgiving, but those simple questions are legal puzzles." Clips of his exchanges had racked up millions of YouTube views. Each followed a pattern. Present a common-sense statement, point out an apparent contradiction, then force the witness into either admitting inconsistency or twisting through an answer that sounds evasive. It worked spectacularly on experts who lived in nuance and data. And today, Kennedy thought, he had the perfect setup. Across from him sat Congresswoman Crockett, a freshman Democrat from Texas, 43 years old, with a decade of courtroom battles behind her. Before running for office, she had defended clients caught in the gears of the justice system, men and women whose names would never appear in headlines. She'd seen the toll of mandatory minimums, years of incarceration for nonviolent drug offenses, families torn apart, communities hollowed out. Her policy views were born not from theory, but experience. She had said it countless times. You can't fix a broken system by ignoring what actually happens to the people inside it. Kennedy and Crockett represented two opposing philosophies, colliding in one hearing. He favored a return to traditional deterrence, strict laws, consistent punishment, simple fairness. She believed in tailoring justice through evidence, not slogans. The hearing itself carried stakes beyond either of them. The Sentencing Reform Act under review could reshape federal sentencing for the first time in decades. Thousands of defendants and countless communities would feel its effects. Kennedy viewed the bill as an overreach that would let dangerous people off easy. Crockett saw it as a long-overdue correction to decades of policy failure. Around them, senators from both parties fidgeted with folders and tablets. Republicans had stacks of notes about crimes committed by early-release offenders. Democrats had charts on racial disparity and recidivism. Observers whispered to each other as Kennedy tightened the frame. This wasn't just about a clause in a bill. It was a contest between two visions of justice and two very different approaches to persuasion. "Senator," Crockett began, voice steady, "the contradiction you mentioned is actually why we need more nuanced policy, not less. My opposition to mandatory minimums isn't absolute. It's based on whether they achieve justice and public safety." Kennedy leaned in, the slightest smirk tugging at his lips. "So, if I hear you right, you're for some mandatory minimums, but not others." "That sounds a bit like picking favorites, doesn't it?" "The law is the law. A banker who defrauds 1,000 families and a kid who sells drugs, they both break it. Shouldn't they both face mandatory consequences? Isn't that equality?" His tone stayed genial, but the trap was set. Crockett nodded as if genuinely considering the point. "That's a fair question, Senator. But equality doesn't mean identical treatment. It means fairness grounded in facts." She opened a folder, pulling a page marked with tabs. "Let me give a simple comparison. In medicine, consistency doesn't mean treating every illness with the same drug. Some conditions need surgery, some need rest, some need antibiotics. The principle is consistent care, not identical treatment. In law, it's the same. Proportional justice, not mechanical punishment." For the first time, Kennedy's grin faltered. "With respect, Congresswoman," he said, his drawl sharpening, "we're not talking about diseases. We're talking about people who break the law. Either you believe judges should have discretion or you don't. You can't be half pregnant." The line drew muffled chuckles from some in the gallery. Kennedy's country metaphors always landed well on camera. Crockett didn't flinch. She waited a moment before answering. "Senator, I've represented people in suits and people who couldn't afford shoes. My concern isn't how they look, it's whether justice works. And the evidence shows some of our harshest policies have failed." She raised another page. "The Sentencing Commission's own data shows mandatory minimums for nonviolent drug crimes don't reduce drug use or trafficking. They just swell prisons and devastate neighborhoods. Meanwhile, white-collar crimes, fraud, embezzlement, insider trading, destroy thousands of livelihoods but often get slaps on the wrist." Kennedy adjusted his glasses again, preparing his next move. "So let me make it simple. Yes or no? Should judges have discretion in sentencing?" The question was the fulcrum of his style. A yes trapped her one way, a no the other. Crockett took a quiet breath. Then she smiled again. Small, deliberate, almost amused. "Senator Kennedy," she said softly, "you and I both went to law school. We both know some questions can't be answered truthfully with a single word." Laughter flickered in the gallery. The tension eased just slightly. Even Kennedy cracked a grin. "The principle I support," Crockett continued, "is proportional justice based on evidence. For some crimes, judicial discretion ensures fairness and rehabilitation. For others, especially where powerful offenders exploit loopholes, mandatory floors ensure accountability. The consistency lies in following evidence, not ideology." Kennedy leaned back. "So you're saying we can pick and choose who gets mercy and who doesn't?" "I'm saying justice isn't one size fits all," Crockett replied calmly. "It's measured by outcomes, not optics." The exchange had drawn in everyone in the room. Staffers whispered to reporters. Cameras panned between the two. Kennedy's face was unreadable, caught between challenge and curiosity. The standoff had turned unexpectedly substantive. Crockett wasn't dodging. She was reframing. Kennedy tried again, doubling down on his analogy. "Back home, we've got another saying. You can't be half pregnant. Either you trust judges or you don't." Crockett met his gaze directly. Senator, with all respect, pregnancy is binary. Justice isn't. It's more like medicine. Complex, evolving, requiring judgment. Evidence tells us when a treatment fails, we change it. The same should apply to law. Her tone stayed gentle, even warm. But her words sliced through the metaphor. She continued, "When mandatory minimums fail to reduce crime but succeed in destroying communities, opposing them isn't inconsistency, it's learning. And when white-collar crimes keep devastating families while offenders walk free, supporting tougher accountability isn't contradiction. It's correction." The room had gone silent again. Even Kennedy seemed to weigh his response. Crockett gestured to the charts before her. "I've provided this committee with bipartisan research showing these outcomes. So the question isn't whether I'm half pregnant on sentencing policy. It's whether we're fully committed to justice that works." She paused, then added quietly, "I think that's something you and I might actually agree on." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Kennedy adjusted his notes, an unspoken acknowledgement that the witness had met his challenge without taking the bait. Finally, he nodded. "Well, Congresswoman, you make your argument with style. I still see inconsistencies, but I appreciate your clarity." The chairman's gavel tapped lightly. "The senator's time has expired. Senator Booker, you're recognized." As Kennedy leaned back in his chair, the buzz of whispered commentary filled the chamber. Staffers' phones lit up as clips from C-SPAN began circulating online within minutes. By the time the hearing adjourned 2 hours later, hashtags linking the two lawmakers' names were trending. The video showed not fireworks but something rarer, a genuine exchange of ideas. Reporters swarmed outside the chamber. "A fascinating moment," one veteran Capitol correspondent murmured to a colleague. "She didn't just survive the trap, she turned it inside out." Even a few Republican aides passing Crockett in the hallway offered quiet words of respect. "That was surgical," one muttered. Kennedy, uncharacteristically, lingered in his seat. When a reporter asked for his thoughts, he smiled thinly. "The Congresswoman and I disagree, but she's done her homework. That's more than I can say for most witnesses who sit in that chair." By evening, the clip had spread beyond political circles. Commentators across networks marveled not at confrontation, but at its absence. "What struck me," said one CNN analyst, "was the tone. No shouting, no evasion, just two people actually debating policy." That night, Crockett's staff gathered in her office as views climbed past 10 million. The Congresswoman herself was calm. "Let's keep the focus on reform," she told them. "This isn't about me or him, it's about the system." And for once, Washington listened. The next morning, sunlight spilled through the arched windows of the Capitol as the hearing reconvened. The chatter among staffers was different now, charged with quiet anticipation. Yesterday's exchange had turned a routine session into the most replayed clip of the week. Reporters filled every seat in the press gallery, pens and recorders ready, waiting for round two. Senator Kennedy, as punctual as a courthouse clock, entered with his trademark slow stride and a folder thick with notes. He greeted the chairman, adjusted his tie, and nodded toward Congresswoman Crockett, already seated at the witness table. Her expression was calm, eyes focused on her documents, but there was an unmistakable alertness in her demeanor. The kind of readiness that comes from years of trial work, knowing every word in the room could shift the balance. Kennedy leaned toward a staffer and whispered something that made the young aide grin. Then he tapped the microphone. "Mr. Chairman," he said, "before I get started, I'd like to thank our witness for coming back. It takes a lot of grit to face this committee 2 days in a row." Crockett smiled faintly. "Thank you, Senator. Grit's part of the job description." Laughter rippled through the room. Kennedy nodded, flipping through his papers. "Yesterday, we had ourselves a pretty lively discussion about mandatory minimums. I'll admit, I didn't agree with much you said, but you made me think. That's not something that happens every day in this town." A murmur passed through the room. It was rare to hear Senator Kennedy publicly compliment a witness he had sparred with. He continued, "Now I want to move to something that's been bothering me. Accountability. You talk about fairness and proportional justice. But what about accountability for those who make the rules? Congress writes laws that sometimes fail. Judges interpret them inconsistently. Prosecutors cut deals. If we're talking about justice, shouldn't lawmakers, us, be held to a higher standard when our policies fail? The question caught everyone off guard. Even some of Kennedy's colleagues looked up, surprised. This wasn't the typical cross-examination. It was philosophical, almost self-reflective. Crockett looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Senator, I couldn't agree more. Accountability should start at the top. When laws cause harm, when sentencing rules destroy families or fail to keep people safe, then it's not the citizens who failed the law. It's the law that failed the citizens." Kennedy's brow furrowed. "That's a strong statement. Are you saying Congress should admit guilt?" "I'm saying we should admit mistakes," Crockett replied. "Justice isn't static. It evolves when we have the courage to face what didn't work." She turned a page in her binder, her tone calm but cuttingly direct. For decades, Congress passed laws under the slogan of being tough on crime. But we were measuring success by conviction rates, not by whether our communities became safer or stronger. Now we're sitting on the highest incarceration rate in the developed world. That's not justice, it's policy failure. A quiet hum filled the chamber. Kennedy tapped his pen thoughtfully. "So you'd say we should apologize?" Crockett tilted her head slightly. "Not apologize, Senator, repair. Apologies don't change systems. Reforms do." That one line hit like a gavel strike. In the back row, reporters typed furiously, capturing every word. Kennedy leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "You make it sound easy. Repair. But tell me this. What do you say to a mother whose child was killed by someone released early under a reform law? You tell her it's part of the process?" His tone had turned sharp again, the empathy edged with challenge. Crockett didn't hesitate. "I tell her the truth," she said softly, "that no law can bring her child back, and that the only way to honor that loss is by preventing the next tragedy, not by clinging to policies that failed to stop the first one." Her words didn't rise in volume, but their steadiness carried across the room. Kennedy's expression shifted. Less adversarial now, more contemplative. "You talk like someone who's lived this," he said. "I have," Crockett replied quietly. "I've seen families destroyed by crime and by the system meant to protect them. I've seen people who made one mistake lose their whole lives. And I've seen people with money and influence walk away from the same mistakes untouched. Justice isn't just what happens in court. It's what happens after the cameras leave." The room was completely still. Even Kennedy's staffers had stopped whispering. The chairman cleared his throat. "Senator, do you have further questions?" Kennedy nodded slowly. "Just one." He leaned forward again, resting his elbows on the desk. "Congresswoman, if you could rewrite our sentencing laws tomorrow, every page, every statute, what's the first thing you'd change?" Crockett smiled faintly. "The mindset." Kennedy raised an eyebrow. "The mindset?" "Yes," she said. "We write laws like we're punishing problems instead of solving them. We react to fear instead of responding to evidence. If we change that, if we started asking what works instead of what sounds tough, the rest would follow naturally." Kennedy sat back, silent. The audience waited for his retort, but none came. Outside the chamber, after the hearing adjourned, the air buzzed with reporters shouting questions. Crockett made her way through the crowd, stopping only once to answer. "What do you think of Senator Kennedy's line of questioning?" One reporter called out. Crockett smiled. "He asked the right questions," she said simply. "That's how progress starts." Across the hall, Kennedy gave his own brief statement. "The Congresswoman's tough," he told cameras. "We don't agree, but she's honest. I respect that." The clip aired on every network that night. For once, a Senate hearing was trending not because of shouting, but because of mutual respect, an almost foreign concept in modern politics. That evening, Crockett returned to her office overlooking the Capitol dome. Her staff had been monitoring reactions all day. The clip from her testimony had already passed 30 million views across platforms. The comments were divided, but the tone was unmistakably different. Some praised Kennedy's civility. Others hailed Crockett's clarity. The rarest sentiment of all appeared again and again beneath the viral posts. Finally, an actual conversation. Her chief of staff entered, tablet in hand. "You're on every outlet tonight. CNN, Fox, PBS, even late-night talk shows are running the exchange." Crockett chuckled softly. "For talking about sentencing law? That's a first," he nodded. "They're calling it the moment Washington remembered how to listen." Crockett leaned back in her chair, gazing out the window at the Capitol illuminated against the night sky. "Let's hope it lasts longer than a news cycle," she said quietly. Across town, Senator Kennedy sat alone in his office. The desk lamp cast a warm circle of light over stacks of papers and an untouched cup of coffee. He replayed the hearing on his laptop, fast-forwarding to his exchange with Crockett. There was something about her answers that lingered. Measured, grounded, resistant to his usual tricks. He scribbled a note on a yellow pad. "Ask Crockett to co-sponsor judicial discretion bill draft." Then he paused, staring at the words. The idea was radical, even risky for his base, but there was logic to it. He'd always said he wanted laws that worked. Maybe that meant working with people he didn't always agree with. He folded the note, slipped it into his jacket pocket, and smiled to himself. "Well, John," he muttered, "maybe you just got schooled by a freshman." Over the next weeks, the ripple spread through Washington. Policy analysts cited the Kennedy-Crockett exchange as a rare model of bipartisan discourse. Editorials in major newspapers called it a glimpse of what democracy looks like when conviction meets humility. Podcasts dissected every line. Law professors used it in lectures on persuasive dialogue. Even high school debate teams analyzed their rhetorical strategies. The most surprising development came a month later, when Senator Kennedy introduced a modest bipartisan bill expanding judicial discretion in sentencing, a version of the reform Crockett had long championed. When asked about it, Kennedy said simply, "I still believe in being tough on crime, but I also believe in being smart." The Congresswoman made a fair point. If a law stops working, you fix it. The bill passed out of committee with overwhelming support. At the next hearing months later, Kennedy and Crockett crossed paths in the hallway. Cameras flashed as they shook hands. "Didn't expect to see our names on the same bill," Kennedy quipped. Crockett smiled. "Justice makes strange allies," he laughed. "Guess it does. You keep talking sense like that, you'll ruin my reputation." She laughed too, and for a moment, the tension of Washington politics seemed to dissolve into something simpler. Mutual respect forged through debate, not destroyed by it. As they walked into the chamber together, a young staffer watching from the corner whispered, "That's what it's supposed to look like." By year's end, the bill had become law. It wasn't sweeping reform, but it gave judges new flexibility to consider individual circumstances, small steps toward the proportional justice Crockett had argued for. In a floor speech celebrating its passage, Kennedy addressed the Senate. "We didn't fix everything, but we fixed something, and that's a start." The Congresswoman from Texas, and I don't see the world the same way, but we both want it to work better. If we can agree on that, maybe there's hope for the rest of us. His words drew applause from both sides of the aisle. Crockett, watching from the House chamber, smiled quietly. That night, she sent him a short handwritten note. "Senator, thank you for proving that civility isn't weakness. It's the foundation of strength." Kennedy wrote back 2 days later, "Congresswoman, I'll drink to that. Sweet tea, of course." Outside the marble halls of Congress, the exchange continued to echo. Students studied it, journalists referenced it, and citizens who had long tuned out political hearings found themselves talking about sentencing reform at dinner tables and in classrooms. Not because it was glamorous, but because, for once, it felt real. In the end, it wasn't the clash that made history. It was the conversation. The soft-spoken Congresswoman and the sharp-tongued senator, two people from opposite ends of the political spectrum, had reminded the country of something forgotten, that democracy doesn't have to roar to be powerful. Sometimes it just has to listen. The hearing room where it all began stood empty again, the microphone silent, the chairs neatly pushed in. The echo of their voices lingered in the air like the memory of a rare kind of honesty. And somewhere beyond the walls of Washington, someone watched the clip again on a glowing screen and whispered the same thought millions had shared that week. This is how it's supposed to be.